So thanks so much for the invitation and for an opportunity to discuss what's a very topical issue for many, for everyone really, but something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about over the years. And I work in this area, as Andrea said, of risk governance and low probability, high impact events like a pandemic. And so I'm going to spend a little time talking about some of the research I've done over the years and offer some things to think about, tools and techniques that might be of some value to you. So the presentation will largely be about uncertain risks. I called it, the title originally, Uncertain and Emerging Risks, but I'm just going to footnote that I'm going to use those two. I'm going to use the term uncertain risk today. I don't really particularly want to get into a debate about the difference between uncertain and emerging, but for our purposes today, they're actually quite similar. So I'm going to refer to them as uncertain risks, but they're both terms that are used in the IRGC framework, and I can refer you to that material. But for purposes of today, an uncertain risk will suit our needs. I'll also offer some reflections on COVID-19 and think about some scenario planning tools that might help us in these particularly uncertain times. So, just a quick piece about the MacEachen Institute. So we're a public policy institute at Dalhousie University. We support good public policy discussion and debate and research. We host a lot of panels. We do a lot of roundtables. We do a lot of research in different areas. And we're particularly interested in risk governance issues on low probability, high impact events. And in fact, recently we've just published some material on scenario planning, which is on our website if you'd like to take a look at it. So to start us off, I want to start here and talk a little bit about the Humboldt Bus Crash. And I'll just forewarn that I've got a lot of slides today, but I'm going to go through them quickly. It's going to sort of help me develop this narrative. But I want to start here with the Humboldt Bus Crash, an incident, of course, we're all very familiar with. 14 people died at the scene of the collision, with a further 2 dying later as a result of their injuries. 13 were injured. Most of the victims were under the age of 22. And it's symptomatic of although it was a very high-profile event and it got a lot of coverage, and there's a lot of interesting literature in the sociology of risk about how we recognize death and frame death stories in the media, etc. And many of the characteristics of sort of a high dread, high-profile risk scenario would be captured by that, particularly because there were so many young people involved. So those are the kind of stories that can really get a lot of media coverage, and there's a lot of grief, profound grief, I think, for the families, but also we can identify with that, empathize with that. But it is symptomatic of a bigger issue, which is road safety. And so if we're looking at the 2018 data, 1,922 fatalities, or about 5 people every day, die on Canadian roads. It's much higher in the United States, about 36,000 people that die a year in the United States, but 1,922 fatalities in Canada, about 9,494 injuries, serious injuries every year. And about 20% of those fatalities occur among people under the age of 25. So it's really a risk that's distributed across a lot of age groups. It's not necessarily concentrated in one particular group. So why do we accept or tolerate these risks? And so different disciplines actually will come at these problems in different ways. An actuarial scientist might do value of statistical life calculations, which are fraught with a lot of interesting controversies. And I'll just signal that I wrote an op-ed about this in the Globe and Mail after the Humboldt Bus Crash, about how difficult it is to actually put a dollar value on a life. Particularly in some of these sort of high-profile events. But of course, we do it all the time, right? The insurance companies, the insurance industry put dollar values on death and injury and compensate people after there's been death in the family or there's been injury. So we actually are familiar with putting dollar values on life, but it's not something we necessarily talk about all that comfortably. And in high-profile events, when there's a lot of public grief, and also, family grief and et cetera, we tend not to talk about those issues. But an actuary does actually put dollar values on lives, and there are tools like the value of a statistical life that can help us to think through, analytical tools that can help us to think through how to value statistical lives, but also how to make decisions about how to allocate limited resources to manage risk. So effectively, it becomes a sort of cost-benefit analysis. And it's worth just noting in the U.S., for example, in the U.S. they have to do cost-benefit analyses before they can get legislation through. So it requires that you put a dollar value on life. As I said, I don't want to get into the controversies of value of statistical life, but there are many, many controversies associated with this concept, and I would just refer you to at least to that op-ed that I wrote in the Globe and Mail a couple of years ago, which I can make available to Andrea as well after this talk. But the libertarian might think of the right to take risks. You have the right to take risks if you wish, and one is also responsible for one's own actions. So if you drive a car and get in a car accident, then you're responsible for that. Business schools might also think about cost-benefit analysis, and also the optimism that we can learn from mistakes and make things better. A sociologist or anthropologist might suggest that we have no choice but to take these risks, partly because we live in a society that has been built using cars, that it's just embedded in the culture. One, we don't necessarily have the data available to inform our risk decisions, but more importantly, it's been normalized. We don't really think about the risks associated with driving a car. We just get in a car and do it. And in a lot of ways, we're sort of driven, quote unquote, to do this because we have to get to work or we have to live our lives, and we just simply don't think about these risks. But the sort of society has formed itself in a way to kind of nudge us and pressure us into behaving in this sort of way. Psychologists might talk about the optimism bias, which is the fact that we are highly optimistic. We can recognize there's a risk, but we're highly optimistic about ourselves, and we in certain cases estimate that we're not likely to suffer from these risks or these threats or dangers or adverse consequences. We're optimistic about our own ability, so we can sort of see that there's a problem in society, but we don't really think we're at risk of it. We also tend to when it comes to driving, we think we have a lot of knowledge and we can control cars. A lot of things about cars you don't control, the design of it, the roads, the speed limits, things like that, all the drivers around you, you don't control that, but we tend to think somehow, psychologists will tell us, we tend to think that we control a lot of, we feel we can control a car. Public administration, people will think about regulation, but where we get our information, applying standards, changing behavior through licensing, penalties, traffic tickets, speed limits, all the sort of constraints that we put on driving to make it safer. So there are various ways of thinking about these things, and many of these things feed into risk governance in different ways. There's no one way to approach managing risk, but different disciplines will bring different perspectives. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of some of the work that psychologists bring to this area, and some of the challenges it poses for us when we're thinking about pandemics. So how do we put something like the Humboldt Bus Crash alongside COVID-19? How do we think about those two issues? Well, if we think about it just in terms of fatalities, in between 2009 and 2017, we on average had 1,809 deaths in Canada on the road, and already in a few months, or 3 months, not even 3 months, we have over 5,000 deaths in Canada. But if we were to extend that a little bit, and think about how many deaths have we had on the road since the last major global pandemic that we had to address, which was H1N1, that actually over this period of time we've had 16,000 deaths on the road in Canadian roads. So actually quite a large number. So it really kind of depends a little bit on your point of comparison. I think one of the things I want to emphasize, though, is that there are certain risks where we accept or tolerate deaths. So that death in itself is not exclusively the issue here. There's something more to it. So that's what I want to unpack, because we do tolerate these accidents because it's pretty consistent with road safety. So when we think about a risk calculation of probability times consequence equals risk, this is your traditional understanding of risk. When you think about cars, we have a lot of probability data. Car accidents happen all the time, so we're actually pretty comfortable understanding how likely it is to happen, and then what the consequences are, and that can give us a fairly easy risk measure. And when I say consequences, I'm not talking necessarily about the grief of the families, the grief the families experience when there's a car accident and someone dies in the family. I'm talking about putting the sort of rational analysis and dollar values according to these deaths. But point is that we have a lot of reliable probability data, consequence data, so we come up with a pretty clear understanding of the risk and measure it and feel a certain level of control over it. But with something like COVID-19, with an uncertain risk, we don't really have a lot of reliable probability data. We don't really have a lot of reliable consequence data, and therefore we don't really have a really reliable risk measure. So when we think about risk, the IRGC, the International Risk Governance Council Framework, classifies it in 4 different ways: simple, complex, uncertain, and ambiguous. 4 different types of risk. So when we talk about a simple risk, we're talking about, it's not necessarily simple math, I can tell you, but the number of predicted events is frequent and the causal chain is obvious, so it's a fairly routine-oriented risk, and car accidents would be an example of that kind of risk. When we think about a complex risk, we're thinking about industrial systems, complex relationships between a number of variables. And when we think about interdependent infrastructures, for example, when we think about Deepwater Horizon, for example, that might be the example of an industrial failure that we might describe as a complex risk. When we're dealing with an uncertain risk, we're talking about a risk for which there is an absence of reliable data. A complex risk, we usually have a lot of experience with the technology that we're using. We tend to depend a lot on expert advice. We tend to neglect social concern a little bit with complex risks, it has to be said. We focus a lot on expert advice with complex risks. With uncertain risks, there's an absence of data. So we don't actually know what we're dealing with. And this is more typical of COVID-19, but it's also, there are other kinds of risk events that we could compare to it. Terrorism, rare natural disasters, things like that we could classify as uncertain risks for which there's just an absence of reliable data to know exactly what the probability is and what the consequence is. An ambiguous risk is when we have the data, but there may be some political dispute over what it means. I'm going to pick up on this concept of ambiguous risk a little bit later, but if we think about Wet'suwet'en, for example, the conflict we had in Canada recently where different protesters were occupying the railway line, and you might have some sort of dispute between land rights and the economy that was being disrupted by the blockades. You might have two different worldviews about how to interpret what that event was. So that would be considered ambiguous. We weren't necessarily looking for more data. There was just a conflict in different views of that risk. So when we think about uncertain risks, and this is the one I want to talk about today, you might think about the volcano in Iceland that erupted and disrupted all those flights. You can think about COVID-19 or H1N1, the Las Vegas shooting, climate change issues, terrorism, September 11th, or massive flooding like Hurricane Katrina are all examples of uncertain risks. So just to reinforce this point, an uncertain risk, there's an absence of reliable predictive data, such as pandemics, terrorism. It usually leads to precautionary approaches. These are expensive, and sometimes we can get it wrong. These are some of the characteristics of uncertain risks that are maybe not as common with a simple risk, for example, when you have a lot of predictable data, and it's much easier to forecast. So the IRGC would say there are 4 stages to assessing a risk. The first is pre-assessment, and that's when you do your problem framing, you gather your data, you try to frame the issue. How do we understand this issue? What are our data sources? What are the conventions that we use? Then you move to risk appraisal, which is about the technical risk assessment and also the social concern. Are people concerned about this risk? And then you move to tolerability and acceptability. Can we tolerate this risk? Can we tolerate failure? Can we tolerate negative outcomes? To what extent can we tolerate these negative outcomes? And then we get to risk management, the sort of more conventional risk management. You develop your options, you make a recommendation, and then you start again with pre-assessment. So one of the interesting things I like about the IRGC framework is it overlays the different risk types, and it says that whatever risk you're dealing with, you have to go through all 4 stages. However, there are some stages that require more attention for certain kinds of risk. So when we're thinking about an uncertain risk, for example, you want to spend a little more time on this question of tolerance. Can we tolerate this risk? To what extent can we tolerate this risk? And so this is a very important question for us to think about risk tolerance, but it is easier said than done. So when we're dealing with uncertainty, we tend to think of risk and uncertainty as bad, but it's not necessarily so. Sometimes things don't get as bad as we think. Some sectors see uncertainty as an opportunity, but markets do become jittery in the face of uncertainty, and public servants get nervous about absence of process and rules. So psychologists talk about unknown and high dread. This is one of the concerns when we deal with uncertain risks. People are typically more concerned about risks that are unknown and high dread, and coincidentally, high known, high dread risks have many of the characteristics of a global pandemic. Unknown risks include those that are unobservable, unknown to those exposed into science, new, and have a delayed effect. High dread risks include those that are understood to be uncontrollable, inequitable in their reach, potentially catastrophic, high risk to the future, not easily reduced, include involuntary exposure, and affect people personally. I mean, these are almost descriptions of what's going on with the pandemic. One question people might ask is why aren't we better prepared for these things? And psychologists will refer to the availability heuristic, which is to say, if you haven't experienced it before, it's hard to plan for it. So we shouldn't necessarily beat up on ourselves for not being better prepared for the pandemic. It could be that a very small group of people in different public agencies were saying we really have to get ready for a pandemic. There were a number of experts at the CIA who suggested that we should be getting ready for a terrorist attack like September 11th. But it's very hard to mobilize a lot of resources around those sorts of things when people don't really believe it's true, or they can't visualize it, they just can't imagine it. So you can have even a small group of experts saying we should anticipate this kind of risk. And it was the case before September 11th that there were certain experts saying that the next attack is likely going to be playing as a weapon rather than hostage taking, which had been the case before. But who could imagine September 11th before September 11th? It's very hard to do. So it's hard to plan for it, and it's hard to mobilize resources around it. So this is called the availability heuristic. I want to pick up on that one a little bit later. Also, our rule, one rule is not going to satisfy everyone in terms of risk tolerance. Risk tolerance varies by a number of social factors, including age, gender, income, employment status, ethnicity, lived experiences, disability, geographic location, worldviews, and institutional arrangements all have an impact in our view of risk tolerance, our willingness to take risk. So just for example, in the Angus Reid poll in April 2020, they asked men and women to describe how they feel about, how they feel in light of COVID-19. And not surprisingly, really, women are more worried, more anxious, and less optimistic than men. If you're a risk psychologist, this would not surprise you in the slightest. This is almost completely predictable, particularly in healthcare, because women do a lot of healthcare, and they tend to be more sensitive to those healthcare messages. They're more likely to act on them, and they do a lot of healthcare in our society. Women in this age group, 35 to 54, they get the kids to the doctor, they look after older parents, and they also look after themselves. They do a lot of healthcare. And so actually, interestingly, I used to do an exercise around H1N1 with a number of workshops before, and I used to get the group to try to develop a way to persuade teenagers to get a vaccine for H1N1, because teenagers were the least likely to get the vaccine, though they were highly vulnerable to it. And part of the trick of the exercise was to recognize the influence of mothers in getting their teenagers to get a vaccine. So it's not about addressing a message to a teenager. It's about addressing a message to a mother who can get her teenage son or daughter to the clinic for the vaccine. That's not the only way to do it, but that's just one thing to think about, who influences people when it comes to these things. I want to pick up on this point again, too. Just a few other points, though, on variation. So also on gender, 40% of men did not comply with at least one of the public health measures in place with respect to COVID-19. That's compared to 35% of Canadians on average. 43% of Canadians aged 18 to 24 did not comply with at least one of the public health measures in place versus 35% of Canadians on average. Do you feel that your provincial government should accelerate the pace at which it is relaxing social distancing? And younger people, 18 to 34, were more likely than, say, that particularly the older than 55 age group, and also Americans much more likely than Canadians to say the federal government should relax or accelerate the pace at which it's changing or relaxing social distancing measures. This is also not particularly surprising. I'll get to questions of trust in a second, but the Americans tend to be less trusting of their government and less trusting of government intervention. So relaxing some of those parameters is probably much more consistent with a typical American view of public administration or public policy or the role of government. This doesn't necessarily make them right, doesn't make them wrong either, but it's just worth flagging when we think about what's been happening in Korea, for instance, recently, that Korea seemed to have a very good response in place to the pandemic. They relaxed their constraints, and now there's been a re-flaring up of the disease. And this is in nightclubs, and I'm just going to take a guess that we're talking, in fact, I know that it's a young person, it's a young man, I think a 29-year-old man who was infected and went to various clubs and started spreading the disease. So again, not surprising, young man in particular taking on risk behaviors and doing things that will spread the disease. So my point is that people might want us to relax the parameters. That doesn't necessarily mean it's reflective of the sort of technical medical science of the issue. It's just the way they feel about it, which psychologists are very interested in learning about how do people feel, because the way people feel about things and think about things will tell you something about what they're going to act on and what they're going to do, and that's what we want to know. What kind of behaviors we have to manage. The other thing is we have a hard time with risk trade-offs. So we think about COVID-19 and say going to the gym. So all of our gyms are closed now because we're concerned about COVID-19, but not going to the gym means we're not exercising that much. We're probably not as healthy as we were, a couple months ago. And, heart disease will probably go up as a result of this. But we have a hard time thinking about those kinds of trade-offs. Also, the very obvious one that most people are kind of grappling with now is this question of return to work, the economic consequences in relation to health consequences. Traditionally, we like to think about how do we manage risks down. We want to know what you're doing to manage the health risk down. We have a harder time talking about what's the relationship between COVID-19 and going to the gym, and where's the sort of sweet spot between balancing those risks, or COVID-19 and going back to work. And again, how do we manage those trade-offs? We have a hard time thinking about it. We have a hard time talking about it. We have a hard time measuring it. And as I say, the tolerance is not the same for everybody, so it's hard to know which tolerance level you would use. So when we are dealing with risks, like the uncertain risks, we think about the precautionary principle, and the precautionary principle is expensive, and it can sometimes neglect trade-offs and opportunity costs. So we tend to think about taking a precautionary approach to the particular risk, but we don't always think about what are the other costs that we're incurring as a result of this. So I think we're more aware of it now because all these shutdowns have resulted in high unemployment, and so we're more aware of this trade-off. But this is a thing that risk people think about all the time, the trade-off in risks. There is no zero risk option really ever on the table. There's always some sort of risk trade-off that we have to think about. But a precautionary approach is expensive, but when we're thinking about something that's catastrophic, potentially catastrophic, or irreversible, so in other words, we kind of neglect the probability a little bit, and we look mostly at the consequence and say this could be catastrophic and irreversible. We need to take this seriously, and we need to take a precautionary stance on this particular risk. So yes, it's expensive, but the consequences are very serious, and so we need to, or potentially serious, so we need to take it seriously. Okay, so the problem is precautionary principle itself has lots of controversies that I think we're going to be grappling with in the coming weeks. If we haven't already, what definition are we going to use? There are many definitions of the precautionary principle, and they all imply different sorts of decision points and responsibilities and different nuances. Whose standard are you going to use? What are the ethical considerations of the different definitions of the precautionary principle? Who pays for the precautionary principle, either in cash or who pays by opportunity lost, right? So if you have high standards for, closing down economies, then who's paying the cost of that precautionary stance? Someone's always paying when you're taking a precautionary stance, right? So who pays? Who proves that it's dangerous or it's safe enough to return? Who makes that decision that it's okay? Is it a business decision? Is that a government decision? Is that a chief medical officer of health decision? Who remains vulnerable when we take these precautionary stances? So we know that there's still some trading going on. There's still trucking going on. There's still the grocery stores are still open. The liquor stores are still open. Some people are still exposed to risk. So not everybody's being captured by this precautionary approach. Who gains by it? When a vaccine is created, of course, that'll be a very, very big money spinner, as was the case with H1N1. How reliable is the data that we're using? When it's uncertain risk, the data can sometimes be very questionable. How aggressively is this principle enforced? You think about, do we throw people in jail for going out of their homes when they shouldn't be, or do we just have friendly officers come along the park and say, hey, you really should be going home now, you shouldn't be staying in the park? So there's aggressive enforcement and there's very relaxed enforcement, and there's a whole bunch of options in between. But there's still a question about how aggressively do you enforce these principles? And then, of course, how long do you put the precautionary principle in place? Who do you trust to enforce these or to make these decisions? As I say, the U.S. trusts government a lot less than the Canadians do, and that's historically been the case for a long time. That data has been the case for a long time. So Canadians tend to trust their governments, and when we think about trust, we're looking for three qualities: openness, knowledge, and concern. That's what, if people feel that, say, chief medical officer is open, knowledgeable, concerned, they're likely to generate trust, and governments tend to be predisposed to trusting their public officials. Which is a good news story for us, I think, at this point, because we do need to have medical scientists providing good advice, and we need people to trust that advice. So it's good to trust public institutions at this particular moment in time. It's going to get a little more complicated in time too, mind you, but I think we're starting in a good place with a predisposition towards public institutions and trusting the advice of public institutions. And of course, I note as well at the bottom that scientists are highly trusted, and I think you can put chief medical officers of health in that category, more so than CEOs of corporations, and CEOs are more trusted than elected officials. And so that's an interesting issue too, because when it comes down to relaxing the parameters around social distancing, I think there's going to be some good questions about who's going to make that call, who do we want to make that call, who's going to trust in that call. So it's likely going to have to come from the chief medical officer of health or the science community. That probably will be more effective than CEOs from corporations saying it's okay to relax the parameters of this. So we have to sort of keep these issues in mind. I just point out that some of these fault lines in the U.S., I mean, they've been present for quite some time, but even again yesterday, Senator Rand Paul in the U.S. Senate said, I think we ought to have a bit of humility in our belief that we know what's best for the economy. As much as I respect you, Dr. Fauci, I don't think you are the end-all. I don't think you are the one person who gets to make the decision. So Dr. Fauci, very high-profile figure in the White House, of course, who seems to have a lot of respect, but openly being questioned by Senator Paul yesterday about whether or not Dr. Fauci is maybe seen to be the only decision maker in this process that's actually more complicated. And so in some ways in the U.S. what you're seeing is a shift from an uncertain risk to an ambiguous risk, where there's more politics and more worldviews in play over this issue. So how do we address some of these complicated situations? So I'm just going to run through a few slides on scenario planning to provide some advice about where to from here. Certainly in the IRGC context, we would talk about when we're looking at uncertain and emerging risks, scenario planning can be a useful tool. It allows for the fact, I think, that there may not be reliable data in play, and you want people to think about different options and quite dramatic options that maybe they haven't thought about in the past. So when we talk about scenario planning, a scenario is a description of a possible future. It's a hypothetical sequence of events that is helpful in investigating causes and necessary decision points. It's not a prediction of the future. Scenario planning goes beyond typical forecasting exercises and thinking in terms of incremental changes. It describes quite different futures and invites us to think about how to respond to them. So my point here with this scenario planning school that I want to, intuitive logics is what I'm going to be referring to. We're really not thinking about, the sort of traditional forecasting approach based on historical data. We're trying to get away from that, trying to think about quite different futures. So we don't want to be beholden to past experience. We want to think differently. And so scenario planning can provide us with some tools to think about those sorts of things. So there are many methods of scenario planning. I would underscore. Here we talk about intuitive logics, and that's the work of Van der Hagen, Van Asselt, and others, with some modifications of our own. And on our website, you'll find a full report on scenario planning and a brief user-friendly report for those wishing to use scenario planning process techniques and tools if you want to inform yourself more on this work. So just to run through some of the stages of scenario planning, why would we do it? To change the mental map of organizational leaders, to overcome groupthink, to foster some out-of-the-box thinking, to understand how the organization can continue to fulfill its mission in light of a high level of uncertainty, and also encourage adaptive capacity in the organization. How do you structure a scenario planning session? Well, you have participants you organize participants from a wide range of views from within the organization. It is not necessarily the case that you would want to bring people from each organizational unit in your organization together. One has to be mindful that if you're with some scenario planning exercises, if you bring representatives together from each of the divisions of your organization, then they might come at it with a territorial mindset. And they're there not because they're clever or they're creative or they're entrepreneurial or they're effective at these kinds of exercises. They're there because they're from Division A or Division B or Division C. So in some respects, you might find yourself just having a scenario exercise where you're reinforcing the organizational design that might be part of the problem in the first place. So I think it's important to think about inviting people who are creative and entrepreneurial, and there's an awareness of the different aspects of the organization, different perspectives, but I'm not sure I think you have to think carefully about inviting people just to represent each of the boxes, because you could get yourself into just a straightforward turf war on that. You also want people who are, stakeholders who are familiar with your key stakeholders for your organization. And the other characteristic from this literature would be that people come as individuals, and there are no hierarchies to session. So we're talking about roundtable dynamics. That said, how do you actually do that? It's easier said than done. If you invite the boss into the room, then sometimes you get this sort of dynamic that people want to agree with the boss, et cetera, et cetera. Or as I say, different divisions might create some turf wars. So I think you want to organize the session in a way that allows for the free exchange of ideas and a roundtable environment. So you do need to think about the context and where the authority lies, and maybe the managers are doing one in one room and different staff levels are in different scenario exercises. I do think you need to keep the power dynamic in mind when you're organizing these sessions, because ultimately you want a kind of free flow of creative exchange of ideas. So when we're studying the scenario agenda, you start with some sort of mission statement. You might want to revisit the mission statement at the end of all this, but some sort of goal or objective, an overarching goal that you might have for the session that is a unifying concept. Because starting off a conversation without a unifying concept can be quite difficult. Why are we here? What brings us together in this particular circumstance? So I think it's important to have something. So a mission statement, if you've got a good mission statement, it's a good place to start. This is the mission of this organization. This is our purpose. That's what brings us together to have this scenario session. And then you're ultimately going to get to a question about what is the impact COVID-19 is having on us, but you want to have some sort of overarching statement about your mission. You want to think about the timeline, and I think that's a really big question right now that people are thinking about. Are we thinking about, typically with scenario planning, you might be thinking about a year out, 2 years out, 5 years out, but in some cases we're really thinking about 3 months, 6 months, and I think some of these tools are still well suited for these purposes, but you do have to understand your timeline. So you might be doing various exercises, one that's 3 months out, one that's 6 months out. It's always helpful to have some sort of SWOT or pestle analysis before you get going, so people are kind of aware of the data that you have. Then you set the context, which is to say some sort of description of the status quo, the organizational design, the key stakeholders, the people who are responsible, the decisions that have been made. Why does your organization exist the way it does? Why is it structured the way it is? And then you might think about what COVID-19 has done to your organization, what impact has it had. And in some of these scenarios, it's worth considering it's not exclusively about COVID-19, right? It's what vulnerabilities has something like this exposed in your organization. You don't want to get too narrowly focused on COVID-19. It might expose issues like, you're too reliant on one source. For your supply chain, there's a single point of failure that can have a cascading effect. Maybe you're too dependent on certain markets that you can't access now. But you really want to get, ultimately, when you get scenario planning, you want to start thinking about the causes that underpin these vulnerabilities and the opportunities, and try to create a greater understanding. So we want to think about the impact that COVID-19 is having. What is the impact 3 months from now, 6 months from now, a year from now? But try to get to the causes. That's one of the important parts of this kind of scenario planning exercise. What are the causes that are underpinning these vulnerabilities? So then you get to the next step, which is about determining the driving forces. When we think about driving forces, we're thinking about the environmental factors that influence a possible outcome of a critical uncertainty for the organization. So what are the things that are absolutely crucial for your organization's success, that are high risk right now and high impact? This can be a brainstorming exercise. You put a lot of variables on the board. We have identified many here for you: customers, your ability to travel, your access to natural resources, trade, borders, social distancing measures, the unemployment rate, can you access labor, what is the cost of energy, can you access the U.S. market, what is the value of the U.S. dollar, government support programs that have been put in place to support people, how long are they going to last, and what are the consequences for your organization if they don't. A number of things to think about that might have some sort of impact. One of the things I would encourage you to think about, though, are some of these things do not exist within your control. So like the value of the US dollar, you have no control over that, but actually it's very, very crucial to an outcome. This is a way to get you thinking outward rather than inward, not just about what things you can control, which we tend to kind of gravitate towards, particularly in these sort of pandemic scenarios. What can we control? But it's actually we have to be adaptive in light of changes that are going to happen over which we have no control, like the value of the US dollar, like access to the US market, for example. So then you would score them, rank them, take two, high impact, high uncertainty drivers, and then play it out in a scenario. So your driving force 1 is high, driving force low is 2, driving force 2 is low, driving force 2 is high, and you start to paint the picture of those 4 scenarios. So I've just put a few examples down for you. Customer demand for your service is high or low, the supply of labor is high or the supply of labor is low. So scenario 1 is customer demand high, supply of labor low. Scenario 2 is customer demand high, supply of labor high. Scenario 3 is customer demand low and supply of labor low, and scenario 4 is customer demand low, supply of labor low. Okay, I put in a few other ones for you to think about. These are not necessarily variables that are out. These are variables that are more specifically concerned about COVID-19, but just to get you thinking, there are a number of variables you could pick, but outbreak, contained or not, limited opening, or a community that's very open. So limited opening of the economy, or limited opening of your community, very large opening of your community. Outbreak contained, anxiety levels are high. So even if the community is open, people aren't willing to actually go out and shop, for example. Maybe anxiety level high, low is the key consideration. Outbreak contained, second wave returns might be a second variable for you to think about. And then your community is open and closed. So ultimately, you want to get to a point where you're describing each of these, and you describe whatever variables you pick. You want to describe these scenarios very thoroughly. What does the scenario look like? How did you get to this scenario? What are the underlying causes that led to this? What are the potential critical failures? What are the opportunities? And then give the scenario some sort of name that allows you to remember it. So you go through each of the 4 boxes and you describe those scenarios. Then the next stage is to think about that these are the scenarios that you're going to have to respond to. You can't really control them, or largely you can't control them. So then you start to think about policies that you can develop, or strategies you can develop to respond no matter which of the 4 scenarios emerges. So it's not about developing policies for one specific scenario. It's about developing policies that will allow you to be adaptive in light of any of the 4 scenarios. So you might think of organizing these things according to cybernetic understanding of control, which means 3 categories: information, standards, and behavior modification. So what information gathering are you going to have to do? What information are you going to need access to? What standards should you adopt in light of these 4 scenarios? And what behaviors do you want to encourage or discourage in light of these 4 scenarios? Generally speaking, you want to have some sort of capacity for information gathering because you need to know which scenario is emerging. I think in an uncertain risk, we talk about flexible standards that can be adapted because we're not really sure which scenario is going to emerge. So we need to be kind of light on our feet, have some adaptive capacity. You might also want to think about different timelines. What does the next 3 months look like? What does the next 6 months look like? Or a year, and then also some different variables, and then you can play out these different scenarios. I mean, I think one of the important things is to recognize that it's a reflective exercise, it's narrative based, so it's about having strategic conversations, forcing people to think of the different boxes, not just think about the worst case scenario, but think about possible opportunities, good scenarios that could come out of this, and how would we exploit those good scenarios. So I think the 4 boxes can help you to think about the good stuff and the bad stuff and get people thinking, how do we seize opportunities, how do we manage some of these dangers, etc. So just some concluding comments on this. So generally with uncertain risks, we have the problem of psychological phenomena in the face of uncertainty. There are various ways to think about risk tolerance, and then there's an optimism bias that we have that maybe prevents us from thinking about dangers, but also questions of high dread, high uncertainty, and probability neglect, thinking only about the consequences or bad consequences, but not actually thinking about the probability that those things will happen, which is important. I put in this line, mother knows best, and soccer moms and smoking in Toronto, just to remind myself that I think that one of the things that I will be thinking about is in terms of the recovery, because women in the sort of 35 to 54 category are very important in terms of managing health risks, I think we're going to have to think about the return to normal is going to depend partly, I think, on this key group. The mums, the suburban mums largely, and what the sort of political aficionados call the soccer moms, right? I think that group's actually a very important group when it comes to healthcare risk. And when I think about, for those of you who can remember the first time Toronto tried a smoking ban in the 1990s, this isn't so much about moms. This is about that it's important to recognize that policies don't just come from government. They are kind of co-constructed. There is a certain social tolerance that probably will emerge, and people will start going out more, whether the government kind of allows it or not. So to a certain extent, it's a bit of a game. Like, what are people going to do, and how are they going to behave, and what are they prepared to tolerate? And so I think a social consensus could emerge. It could leave some people behind, but a social consensus could emerge. So when I think about smoking in Toronto, for example, it was a bylaw that was rushed through a little bit quickly, let's say, not a lot of proper consultation, and not a lot of smart policy levers in place. And as a result, nobody followed the law. So it was a law, but nobody followed it. I mean, it's hard to believe that people kept smoking inside at restaurants and bars, etc., in Toronto in the mid-90s, but they did. They rejected the law. And so then the government had to kind of go back to the drawing board and try again. So just because the government says something's going to happen doesn't mean it's going to happen. There has to be some sort of social contract on this that's going to emerge. A lot of it's going to be underpinned by the science and what the chief medical officers say, and also this acceptance and the anxiety levels that people in our society feel about these risks. And I think a key group is going to be the soccer moms in terms of understanding it. But I think generally speaking, we're going to have to come to a point where we feel comfortable before we're really back on our feet. Remember, the precautionary is always an expensive and potentially narrow option. There are risk trade-offs to think about and opportunity costs. We tend to reserve these things for catastrophic and irreversible risks, and we find ourselves in that situation right now. So it's appropriate that we take a precautionary stance. But as we learn more, as we get more data, we become more sophisticated, we're probably going to start to revisit some of those decisions. We need to think about the importance of surge and retrenchment in highly uncertain situations, our adaptive capacity, and learning as you go. We need to constantly be collecting data and keep on top of this issue so we get the best information to inform those standards and modify the behaviors as we need. The second thing I would just point out is this notion about the second wave. It's in some ways it's a question, in some ways it's an uncertainty of my own. When I think about the availability heuristic, I think that we will call on this memory. One of the challenges that we have in this particular case is we've never lived through a global lockdown like this, but now we have. So when we go through it a second time, I don't think we're going to do it exactly the same way. We're going to be starting from a different place, that we've now been through it. Some things we know worked, some things did not. We're hopefully going to be try to get as much data to understand the risk as best as we can so we can focus our efforts on particular vulnerable areas. But I'm not sure that we would roll it out exactly the same manner, because we've now been through it once. So it's not just that we have the data, but we can also imagine it now in ways that we couldn't imagine it before. To me, though, one of the questions is, are we going to ramp up some sort of massive institutional response in the second wave, in the same way that after September 11th there was a massive ramping up of anti-terror, legislation and practices and strategies, particularly in the U.S.? Or are we going to say, okay, we learned a lot about this crisis, and now we need to think about how to modify our strategy in light of this risk? Now that we're better informed about it, we have better data, we understand this risk better, so now we can have a sort of a more selective and strategic response to it. And so I'm not sure the answer to that. Bureaucracies tend to grow these responses, but also there are lots of economic consequences in place, so I'm not sure if we wouldn't also try to roll some of the things back in the second wave, but I'm not sure. It's just something I'll be thinking about. The precautionary approach, I also wonder about the medical orientation versus the business orientation. How do medical people see precautionary approaches, and how do business people? When medical people think about, catastrophic and irreversible, they're thinking about life and death situations. In business, we might be thinking about a business, going out of business. It's a different sort of scenario, and I'm not sure. I think there's some work to be done there about exploring the different assumptions that underpin them, and how do we reconcile a medical orientation towards a precautionary principle and a business one. And that's some work. I don't think that's a work for the moment, but I think that's work that's coming, that we need to start thinking about these things so we can somehow reconcile these things as best we can. So something to think about. But I think for sure right now medical is the principal concern, and the information of the chief medical officer is of great value, and it's influencing significantly how we're seeing and responding to this, and it's not a surprise to me. That would be typical of what the risk governance literature would suggest anyway. I think finally to say that we're going to eventually shift from uncertain to ambiguous at some point, like the way the U.S. has done, and maybe this is for the second wave, where we start to say, once you get enough data to understand the risk better, we might be shifting a bit more into how do we debate, what are legitimate worldviews to hold that might create political conflict about this risk, and how do we address those political debates in the future about how high do we implement standards, how aggressively do we enforce them, how long do we hold on to a precautionary approach. Again, I don't think that's necessarily a question for today, but those questions are coming, and I think it's already happening in the U.S. There's a debate around whether or not should you speed up the social distancing rules and regulations, etc. So on that point, I'll just thank you so much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this overview. I know we don't have a lot of time for questions. I'm very happy